Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us once again for Write the Docs podcast. I am Jared Morgan, your host, and joining me today is a few different people, but also some regulars as well. So start off with the roster. We'll start off with the regulars. Hello to Chris Ward, who isn't actually in Berlin today. Where are you today, Chris?
I am down south of you in unbelievably the same country, even though it takes hours to get between us, in Melbourne.
Yes.
Back in my second home.
Well, in true Aussie accent, welcome to Australia, mate.
G'day.
And of course, over in the west coast of US, we have Tom Johnson. Hello, Tom.
Hey, Jared. Thanks for introducing me and others.
All right. Now, the difference today is we actually have a special guest on the show, and there's a reason for that. So I'll introduce the guest first. His name is Kadir Topal, and he is the product manager for Mozilla Development Network, or what used to be called that. I'll let Kadir describe a little bit more about what's going on there. Welcome to the show, Kadir.
Hi, Jared. Thanks for having me on the show.
So MDN used to be called Mozilla Development Network. What's it called now?
It's actually now we've rebranded. It's called MDN Web Docs. It started as Mozilla Development Network quite a while ago, and used to be a repository for everything Mozilla related. So if you were working on Mozilla or one of Mozilla's projects, you actually just put your documentation on there. And a while ago, we started focusing on web docs, on web documentation. And over the years, it's really grown to be the main thing that it's known for. So now we have more than 95% of our traffic going to web documentation. So we thought it was time to acknowledge that and rebrand to what we are actually providing now. That's web docs.
That's logical. Well, welcome to the show, Kadir, and thanks very much for joining us. I know it is late where you are at the moment, so it's great to have you on the show.
Thanks.
So we've brought Kadir on the show today because of also because he's been part of Mozilla, but the reason why we wanted to invite him on is there was an article posted up on the Mozilla blog that was entitled "Mozilla brings Microsoft, Google, the W3C, Samsung together to create cross-browser documentation on MDN." This was published back in October 18, 2017. And we wanted to go through this because it's an interesting idea. We see a lot where companies try and establish their own footprint on the web and try to be the canonical resource for information about their particular specialty. But sometimes there seems to be often a bit of a disconnect in how information is structured and how people find information. So we really wanted to get Kadir's insight today about the whole process behind that and why that decision was made to sort of bring everything together. So I think we might actually kick off with you, Kadir. Could you give us a bit of a background to that whole decision and why that was sort of decided upon?
Absolutely. So MDN is really a central resource for web developers today. We have now over 7 million web developers coming to MDN on a regular basis. And that has grown over time to the point where if you're a web developer, you're more likely to use MDN than not to use MDN. And that's not just Mozilla contributing to it. It's been Mozilla MDN is a wiki, so it's really open for contributions, and we need those contributions. We couldn't just do it as Mozilla. So over time, we've gotten lots of contributions from our community to get us to where we are. And part of that has also been, we've been getting contributions from Google and Microsoft and others during this time, because MDN is where developers go already. It just makes sense, or it made sense for them to start documenting on MDN too, to really provide developers with a good experience when there are web APIs they wanted them to use, or features of their browsers that were relevant to web developers. So over time, this had been it got to be something that they just did without a lot of formal process around it. And we realized earlier this year that MDN becoming a resource like that, we thought it would make sense to give it a formal framework. Like, so far, MDN had been essentially driven, the strategy, the content strategy had been driven by Mozilla and only by Mozilla. But MDN being such a central resource for web developers, we thought it would make sense to really, in the sense, to make it a proper open source project and broaden the base for decision making. So that's where the idea for a product advisory board came in, to really formalize a little bit more of the decision making around like what we document on MDN and how we do it and who does it. And that's how it started essentially. And luckily, our colleagues from Google, Microsoft, but also from the W3C and Samsung, they're really open-minded about that, and they wanted to join us to increase their contributions to MDN. So that's how we got the whole thing started. And now we are really excited to actually collaborate together on something that's so relevant for web developers. It just didn't make sense to duplicate that content. Yeah.
Hey, Kadir, I have a question. So what's the main motivation for which people contribute on MDN? Why would a Microsoft or Samsung company or person take a big chunk of their time and write a bunch of docs on web development and put them on Mozilla's MDN?
So I would say essentially there are just as many reasons to contribute as there are contributors. Really, so many of them have their own reasons to, for doing that. We have individual contributors who, like, they see something that's wrong on MDN and they would like to correct that. So they can just go in there and do that, or they are seeing missing information, and they know they are going to need that sometime later too. So MDN is a great place to just document that. Information that you will need later, but also that other people will need. However, when it comes to more corporate contributors, the reasons are a little different. For Microsoft or for Google, it just makes sense because they need, and we all need, web developers to know about the features of the web platform that our browsers support. And because the open web, it's the process of adding things to the open web is so different from like those closed platforms. It's that every browser implements a feature of the open web at a different time. So for example, Google might implement web platform features around payments, which we haven't gotten around to yet. So it doesn't make sense for us at Mozilla to document them yet because they're not supported in Firefox. But they might already be supported in Google, and they want the web developers to know about that. So then they will go in MDN and start documenting it. And it's great because it's this is all standards based. At some point, we will also support that standard in Firefox, and the documentation will already be there, provided by Google.
What about other major? Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Chris. You were going to.
Well, yeah, actually, I think I was about to ask the same question. So I have two questions. One, I think, is the one Tom was about to ask, which was, you've got the vast majority of browsers included here. And the bizarre thing was, it didn't even, these were all browser companies. I mean, Samsung, of course, you forget that probably a lot of people use the default Samsung browser. So yeah, the question I think Tom was going to ask is, what about Apple?
You read my mind.
And also maybe Opera. Opie. I don't know. I use Opera myself, but they're not a particularly big browser. And then I guess the second question was more about after that, when you had all these companies on board, what was the process? Did everyone merge their stuff in, or yeah, what was the process after that? But yeah, firstly, what about Apple? I think is the is the glaring question.
All right. Well, all I can say is that essentially the companies we have now, they're the founders of the product advisory board, but it's not the final list of members. So if you are a significant contributor to the web platform as an individual contributor or as a company, you're still free to apply. We're hoping to actually extend the advisory board over time. So I think that's all I can say about Apple for now. But yeah, I'm hoping that it's not just about Apple, it's also about others. We don't think of this as the full and complete product advisory board, although we have the major browser vendors. We think there are others who can contribute to MDN as well. And we will add more people to the product advisory board over time.
And most browser manufacturers throughout history, apart from a few blips, have generally been fairly good about working with each other and working with the W3C. So you'd hope that would continue, I suppose.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, that's one of the wonderful things about the open web platform. Again, like opposed to closed ecosystems, it's one where you have to collaborate, because getting a web platform feature in just one browser is essentially useless. The whole draw of the web is that it works across silos, like hardware and software silos. Just works across the board. Things work across the board. Like the age-old dream of writing it once and having it work everywhere. That's essentially what the web. Yeah, that's what the web does. But for that, you have to collaborate. So I think it's this really very neat space where we have very fierce competition between browser makers, but also collaboration, a lot of collaboration.
Hey, Kadir, a while ago we did a podcast on Stack Overflow's attempt to create documentation and why that sort of failed. It seems like, this is a similar effort. You're creating documentation. Is the main difference that your participants have more of a stake in the game by influencing what browsers support and standards like that? Is that why your effort here with MDN is going to be successful, whereas the other one failed?
So I can't really comment on why Stack Overflow documents failed. And I think the idea was really neat, but it's a very different model. So I think they really wanted to leverage their great community to provide documentation. And one thing that we've noticed at MDN is that you need people who essentially own documentation, like who can provide structure to things. So we really followed the experiment at Stack Overflow with interest and wanted to see, like, does it actually work to have documentation as an emergent feature, like where you have no structure, nobody providing that moderation. And I still think it can work, but it's difficult. On the MDN side, we have a bit more traditional thing where we actually have owners for material and people who make sure that we follow a certain structure to provide people with content that is coherent across the different parts. And of course, MDN is already a place that developers frequent. So this is we are not in beta. MDN has been out of beta for quite some time, so we've already been successful and getting more documentation from different sources, be it MSDN or also from parts of Google. I think it's just about filling in the gaps that we had or still have, and it's essentially continuing what we've already been doing on MDN. I think Stack Overflow is doing an excellent job. With maybe just a different from a different angle.
How does MDN compare with something like W3C schools? If I Google some CSS question, I often see the W3C schools come up, and it seems like it's got a lot of similar information. Can you briefly just tell us the difference between these two efforts?
Yeah. So you're right. It's a lot of it is the same content, or rather the same topic. So I think what we've seen actually over the years is that W3 schools appeals to a certain segment of the market, and we appeal to a different segment of the market. So it's mostly MDN has a certain breadth and depth that you don't find anywhere else. But that's not necessarily what everybody's looking for. So if you think about actually, this is a concept that came up at one of the Write the Docs conferences, and we talked about having concept-oriented and action-oriented developers. Concept-oriented developers being those who like to learn by getting the high-level overview and building up their mental models from there, and then diving into the details. Whereas like action-oriented developers, they like to fiddle with things, fiddle with experiments, see what happens, and then build their mental model from fiddling with things. And those are like the bottom-up and the top-down approach. On MDN, for a long time, we've been great at addressing the concept-oriented developer. Whereas a lot of developers out there are actually action-oriented developers too, and that's been a segment that we haven't addressed as well in the past, and which we actually have been targeting this year. And of course, we think that W3 Schools has been really good at that, at addressing that specific part of the market. So now we are hoping that we can bring that the depth and breadth that we already have, and add to that the action-oriented developer content, which is like examples, lots of examples and interactive examples. So we've been playing around and experimenting a lot with that this year, and you can expect more of that on MDN. So I think that's been traditionally maybe the difference, but I think we're going to see a lot more of the blurring of the lines there. And of course, one thing that is really difficult is getting the depth and breadth of the web platform reflected. And you see that sometimes you'll see outdated content on W3 Schools, or maybe not complete content. That's just because the web is just so huge. We have over 7,000 pages of documentation on the web platform. So keeping all of that up to date is quite a challenge.
Well, how do you do that? I'd actually be interested to know how you do that.
Yeah, me too. That sounds like almost insurmountable, but you managed to do it. Tell us more.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So one part of it is really relying on our community, because the web is changing in not in a coherent manner. It's not like you don't have the web 5.3 and then like next month the web 5.4. It's like there is no versioning like that going on where you can say like, all right, we've documented this version of the web, let's move on and let's document the next. There is nothing like that, which makes it quite challenging. Different browsers implementing different parts of the web. That's all really a challenge. So the one way we do it is through our community, and we've, of course, like at Mozilla, we focus on Mozilla products first because those are the ones that we know about. We know what's going to come down the line. We can prepare for that and focus on documenting that. And we can rely on our community to document some of the other browsers. And the great thing is that so far, part of our community has also been like people from Google. And now with the product advisory board, we formalized that. So that's how we hope to actually be even more up to date and provide information on all the browsers out there and about the web platform. So by relying on our community, which now also includes the big browser makers, who, instead of documenting it on their own site, are now combining it with what we have for one place where you essentially learn about the open web.
Mm-hmm.
I was just looking at some of the stats in the blog post, and I have to say they are pretty impressive. You did touch on some of these numbers before, Kadir, I think, but I think I'll just quote some of the figures here. So this year alone, there were 8,021 users on the site that made 76,000 edits just this year alone. That is some incredible collaboration going on there on the site. And in particular, the more corporate collaborators that we're talking about were for, I think, Microsoft Writers accounted for about 5,000 edits so far in 2017. So that's some big numbers there. I'm interested in, having never actually been on MDN before and had a look at some of the stuff there. What is the general process for actually creating an edit on the site? How does it normally go from a workflow perspective? Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Oh yeah. So you mentioned our really large number of contributors, and we're really grateful to have them. I should say that part of that is also localization. So MDN doesn't only exist in English; it actually exists in 40 different languages.
Wow.
Like at various stages of completion, of course. So part of that contribution is localization on MDN. So when you're talking about like editing on MDN, that is definitely a part of it. And there is not just one standard way of adding content to MDN. So there are a bunch of different ones. Like there are sometimes you have new web platform features, new APIs, and then you have to start from scratch and essentially just write new documentation. And that involves going through the standards documents, because W3C, it already does have the standards themselves documented. It's just not necessarily meant for developers. It's meant for implementers, for browser makers. So part of this process is essentially then translating what you find in the standards document to what's relevant to web developers when they actually use it to build things with it. So that would be one way to do it when you have a new feature on the web. But then very often you will also have just changes to the web platform. Things that previously worked one way are now working in a different way. Then it will be about essentially going into a document that already exists and editing it. And I have to say, all of this is essentially open at the moment. So there is no upfront editing process on this. It's all after the fact. So that's essentially, it's like Wikipedia currently. So those are the two main ways that you would essentially edit documentation on MDN, and then localization being another aspect of this, where almost all of the time, actually always, you would start with an English document, make sure it has all the content that's necessary, and then go on translating that into the language of your choice.
Right. So two aspects: there's translation and also sort of new articles creation and all that sort of thing. So that is very interesting. Now, I do have another question as well, and this is probably relating to more technical writing workflow, but I know that you mentioned earlier that MDN is wiki-based. Did you ever ponder going towards maybe a distributed VCS model and going down the path of contributions through merge requests, or that type of approach rather than going for a wiki?
Oh yeah, it's actually kind of funny because we are in the process of transitioning a little bit.
Oh, right.
Yeah, so right now what we are doing is with our browser compatibility data, it used to be just really data within the wiki document. And just to explain a little bit, browser compatibility data is relevant for web developers. It's not part of a web standard. It's not part of a normal documentation process, but that's about what web browsers are currently supporting or have supported in the past or going to support in the future. So as a web developer, you not only have to care about the web standard itself, you also have to care about which parts of it are supported in which browser, and what's the market share of that browser. Does it matter to you that browser doesn't support it or not? So this is really quite relevant information. It's not part of the standard, but something that's changing all the time. So that used to be just part of an article, and we thought that that's really relevant information that you want to have in different places. So just making it machine readable data made sense to us, like data that you can then take and put into different contexts. So earlier this year, we started transitioning that compatibility data to GitHub and to JSON format. So now we are like right in the middle of it. Part of it is still in wiki format on MDN because there is a lot of it, and we are moving it by hand. So it's going to take us a while. But that's part that is that is something that you can today contribute to by sending us a pull request. And we are also using this to test the waters a little bit, to see whether this is a contribution model that works for our community. It's quite different from the wiki model, and we've been discussing which way to go, because of course there are up and downsides with both of them. With the wiki, it's great because it's so open; anybody can just go on the page and edit it. At the same time, that means you have to actually stay on top of it and make sure that you do some editing after the fact. Whereas with the pull request model, the great thing is, like, one downside is that, yeah, there is a barrier. There is certainly a barrier. But the great thing is that you can have a conversation about an edit. So you don't have to reject the pull request. What you can do is essentially ask people to change them in various ways and have a conversation about an edit. That's something that is just a natural part of the pull request model that you don't necessarily see on a wiki.
It's more, I guess, on the wiki, it's more immediate, and then you sort of work out the finer points later, as far as editing goes.
You know, we've been talking about how maybe over time it makes sense to have a wiki model that's really very open in the beginning when you don't have any content or very little content. And as you fill in the gaps and as you go to a point where it's mostly complete to a certain point, it makes sense to change the contribution model. And that's what we're experimenting with now. And I guess we'll see if our community likes this model of contributing to MDN. I think we will test it for other areas as well.
It's a very interesting point you raised there, Kadir, the fact that I think when you're developing content in any context, really, you need to work out the lowest barrier of entry just to get the content in. And the amount of times, I'm sure you've done this, and I think probably Chris and Tom have been part of this as well, that when you're doing quick collaboration with people, there's nothing better than using something a little bit easier, like, say, Google Docs or something, just to get the sort of structure down. And I think I see where you're going there with the whole wiki approach, because it would facilitate that. It would allow people just to get in there, make quick edits, and contribute very, very fast, rather than having the, I guess, a little bit of a heavyweight load that a pull request generally has. And also, from those early stages of content development, you would have such a huge amount of punishment getting all those merge requests merged in order, and then having to go back and do all that sort of
pull requests. Oh my god!
Imagine that. You would need. Just think about that for a minute. You would actually need, if you're using the concept of Wikipedia, you'd almost need an editor per page just to manage the pull requests only. It's a huge effort. So I can totally see why you're approaching this with more of an experimentation mindset initially, Kadir. It seems like a logical approach to me.
Oh yeah, and I mean, it's not necessarily like a one-size-fits-all thing. Like we've just talked about what works and what doesn't work necessarily with like different contribution models. And one thing that we've seen is we've started adding examples to reference pages. And one thing you see over time is that like your example starts very simple because you want it to be simple as the editor of a page. You want it to be like just 5 lines so people can just easily read it. But then over time, as you watch that page, because it's open for everyone to edit, people come in and they just add one more line to the example and one more line here and one more line there. And after 6 months, we look back and all of a sudden it's like a huge example code in the document. That's not what we actually intended to do. And for something like that, it can be better to have more heavier editing, which you would get with the pull request model. So it might be that on one hand, what got us here isn't going to get us there, but also that one size doesn't fit all. So we might have like the wiki model for some parts of the content, whereas like we would have the pull request model for some other parts of it.
Very interesting. So
Kadir, I wanted to ask more detail on something you were describing earlier about how you reuse content. You said you have content reused in multiple places, and for that content, you said you store that in JSON on GitHub and somehow include that on the pages. Can you give us more detail on that?
Oh yeah, absolutely. So I have to say, like, this is something that we would like to do. We saw that especially for compatibility data, it just makes sense to reuse that in different contexts. So right now, it's just part of an MDN article. So you have to essentially come to MDN to see the compatibility data. But if you're a web developer, most of the time you're in your editor, and going to MDN is an extra step. And we would love to actually take that pain away. So if that data was available to your editor, it could actually tell you about the feature that you're using. And if you're using a feature that's currently not supported by the browsers that you need to support, it can tell you right there, right in the editor while you're editing it. But to be able to do that, you actually need that data in a machine-readable format. So earlier this year, we started doing that. We started moving this raw text data that was part of a wiki article. We started moving those over to GitHub in JSON format, essentially. And I think we have now over, I think it was 2,000 pages, 2,500 pages already moved over and available in the machine-readable format. I think all of HTML, all of JavaScript, and a lot of CSS already. So what we want to do with that is essentially, on one hand, make that data more easily editable for us, but also have the data more easily embeddable in other places.
Yeah.
We're hoping to do that with more of the MDN content in the future.
And so this, sorry, okay, go on. Carry on.
I was just going to say, what kind of editors have this integration with this real-time data? Is this, like, give us an example. Is there?
Oh yeah. So right now, none for MDN, because the data simply did not exist. Like we know that a lot of editor vendors that we have talked to, they would have loved to actually do that. It's just that the data did not exist. So we are now there. Yeah, exactly. So we are now there where we now have the data, and now we are actually starting to see some experiments with that already. So I'm hoping that in 2018, you're actually getting to see that live and a bunch of editors out there.
Well, I would imagine that some of the Microsoft tools will probably use it. Like
we hope so.
Visual Studio and VS Code and things like that. I mean, editors have some of this already built in. I could also see this being, I think I use Dash on the Mac, which is like an offline documentation browser, and that uses MDN already. And a lot of the editors integrate with that. Atom, probably, you know, I think I could see this being very useful, just like putting in a CSS property and a pop-up saying, like a linter, you know, this is only compatible in like 2 browsers right now. You sure you want to use this? That kind of thing. Yeah, I can see it being quite useful. And actually, you're right. It's taking documentation to the place where the developers actually are. Yeah, which is something we sometimes think about as technical writers.
No, it's great. It's and you just mentioned that actually some things already integrate with MDN content, and currently they're just scraping the site to get to that content, which is not a very stable way of doing things. So we're hoping to make that easier on everybody involved in this process. And and part of that is essentially changing the contribution model to something different than a raw, unstructured wiki text.
Yeah. Can I actually ask the controversial question? Because I think this is one of the other reasons that some of these attempts at kind of centralization have failed, and you know, you have been around longer. But how do you keep the project funded? I mean, you get a lot of traffic, but that doesn't mean much. So we know numbers with Wikipedia, for example, how much traffic they get versus income is not particularly representative. So how, I'm guessing, and having some of these more corporate kind of partners now might be a part of that. But yeah, how do you keep the project going? How do you keep the lights on?
I have to say this is a service by Mozilla for the open web. Like it's been something that's been funded by Mozilla for years, and Mozilla is still the only funder for MDN. And it goes back to MDN's mission. MDN's mission is to provide web developers with the information they need to build things on the open web. And Mozilla's mission is to keep the web open, because that's fundamentally why we exist. So when you use Firefox, essentially you are contributing to MDN and making sure that the web stays open. Because like a lot of people actually don't know this, but Mozilla is a nonprofit foundation. With a manifesto that essentially says that what we are here for is to keep the web open. So I think MDN is a big contributor to that. Of course, Firefox is too. But MDN plays a big role in that, making sure that web developers have all the information they need to build things on the open web. Yeah, we hope that we will get more contributions from the bigger players. But I think what we are most looking for is actually documentation, because that is hard. And I think it's really one thing that makes MDN even better, because you get the information directly from the people who actually make a browser. Like Jared, you just mentioned Microsoft having more than 5,000 edits on MDN. A good chunk of that is browser compatibility information for Edge. And who better to provide that than Microsoft themselves?
Subject matter experts. Well, may as well leverage it, right? Yeah.
Exactly.
Hey, Kadir, so even though this isn't a service provided by Mozilla, approximately, can you give us an idea of how many full-time paid employees actually make the thing work? I think a lot of times we have this idea that a documentation model can be run and maintained entirely on a volunteer model. I'm just curious, how many paid employees make this work?
So I have to say, just giving the number of paid employees is essentially short-selling MDM, because, as I said, like a good chunk of this is provided by our volunteer contributors, without whom MDM would look nothing like what it does today. So I think Jared mentioned over 8,000 users being on MDN this year and contributing to it. I really think this is that's something that we have to acknowledge as being a big part of it. Like it just would not work without our volunteer contributors, and part of that is because it is so huge. If you have more than 7,000 pages to keep up to date, like it barely matters how big your staff is, unless it's like literally thousands of people. You will fall short. So I think of MDN paid staff more as like the support structure to keep MDN running and to maintain the contributions coming into MDN, rather than like actually the sole people who contribute to MDN or make sure that the content is there. That said, we do have 4 full-time writers working on MDN just for the web content part, and of course we rely on our counterparts at Google and Microsoft for the parts that they are documenting as well, being full-time on it. Aside from that, we have people working on the platform itself and our community. So I'm here as the product manager of MDN, so we have that as well. And of course, all the supporting roles that you need for it, from marketing to branding to visual design and UX design, like all of that is part of what makes MDN work. But our community is really the star, essentially, for MDN.
But I guess so. It's around probably about a dozen all up.
Yeah,
not many,
probably.
Really.
Yeah. No, I mean it's not like we don't have dozens of people working on MDN at the moment, being paid full time to do that. I think it really speaks to how engaged the Mozilla employees are and how much they make work together with the community. Like I can't stress that enough. I know it. sometimes can sound cheesy, but it just wouldn't work on any other.
Here's actually a point, sort of merging those two questions there. Like in some respects, having the potential to have more people with more time invested in it from Microsoft, Google, Samsung, etc., is a good thing. But in other ways, do you have a fear that they may end up dominating the community? This can happen quite often with open source projects where there are people from bigger companies and it seems great to begin with, but then their agenda subconsciously usually starts to dominate too much. And is this something you're concerned about?
Yeah, of course. I mean, it's something that we think about. But at Mozilla, we have quite a lot of experience with that. Like Firefox being a really major open source project that's being used by hundreds of millions of people, where we have hundreds of people employed to contribute to it, but also volunteer contributors from the outside. So on MDN, I think we're not all too concerned with that because we have already been working with these partners in the past. So this is more of like a formalizing how we actually do that and making sure that we are more coordinated about things. So when we come together within the framework of this advisory board, it gives us the opportunity to talk about what's going to be relevant next year and maybe divide the work between us, making sure that we don't reinvent the wheel, that we don't do things twice. Essentially just do the work that we've already been doing, but more coordinated. I think that's just going to benefit everyone involved.
Yeah, that really does sound like the way forward. I'm just looking at the article again, and I noticed there was a quote here from Megan Kearney, the lead technical writer for web developer relations at Google, where she says, Google is committed to building a better web for both users and developers, and we're excited to work with Mozilla, Microsoft, and Samsung to help guide MDM towards becoming the best source of up-to-date and comprehensive documentation for developers in the web. And I think this particular quote gives you a bit of a sense of scale of just how, the fact that, Megan is a lead technical writer for this particular department at Google, that you can actually you can actually use these relationships to just build better documentation and better services. I think it's interesting to see potentially the scale that you'll be able to go to here. It's very good.
Oh yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Oh no, sorry. Go ahead. Comment if you want.
No, I just want to say I think it just makes sense for everybody involved because having the same web standard documented in different places, it's really just a waste.
Yep.
So it just made sense for all of us to combine forces essentially, because it's very difficult for just one party to provide all the data, all the information, and keep it up to date. And it's not a great experience for developers who then have to hunt different pieces of information on different sites. So just bringing it under the same roof and having a coherent user experience for web developers just made sense to us and for all the partners involved as well. So yeah, we're quite hopeful about this.
No, that's definitely true. I mean, really, if you think about it, Google's great for finding information about things, but it doesn't work out what information is actually right. So having everything under one roof and everyone talking to everyone else, yeah, seems logical to me. So yeah, it's great.
So I was just gonna ask, like, so the end goal of MDN, is it so that when a web developer creates a web page and they're coding in Firefox, for example, and they're done, and then they say, well, let me check the other browsers. Let me check Chrome. Let me check Safari. Let me check Edge and some Chinese browsers, and it should all look the same, right? It shouldn't have like massively different padding in a list item because of some property. Like, we're making it so that all browsers render content consistently without needing special hacks for certain browsers. Is that largely one of the goals?
Oh yeah, I mean that is the goal of the web platform and has always been. I mean, I guess we have to acknowledge that it's not always been like that in reality, but that's always, I think, always been the goal for everybody involved. And I think we are getting there. So if you I started as a web developer in the late 90s.
Yeah, likewise, I remember.
It was terrible. It was horrible.
Yeah.
But in the meantime, I think we've all learned how to play together a lot better. Everybody got better at writing web standards, because oftentimes, actually, that's the source of all those different implementations. So I think we all got better at doing this. And again, I mean, it's not like with one vendor that owns a platform and can implement one thing. It's like different companies and different players trying to implement the same standard. There are bound to be differences and different understandings. So it's I think we've come a long way towards alleviating that pain for web developers. If you look at something like CSS grids that landed this year, it actually landed in almost all the browsers at almost the same time, and with implementations that were very similar. Of course, you might have a bug here or there that takes a release to iron out. But generally today, especially for something like CSS grids, you can write code that just works across all browsers. And because we have those faster release cycles these days, like you don't have to wait another 18 months for a bug to be fixed and for users to actually adopt that new version. So that also, I think, plays a role in how people are starting to maybe experience the web platform more as like one thing, rather than having to code just for Firefox or just for Safari or just for Chrome. And of course, that's what we strive to do at Mozilla and MDN as well. Like I just told you about MDN's mission, but our vision really is that everybody who writes for the web platform just uses open web standards and have it just work.
To have it just work. Who wouldn't want that? That sounds fun to me. Well, I think we are drawing towards the end of our time together today, which has gone, I'll admit, quite fast today, because it's been an incredibly interesting discussion with you, Kadir. Thank you so much for your time today. And
thanks for having me, Jared. This has been a lot of fun for me too. And thanks, Chris, and thanks, Tom. This has been really awesome.
And thank you, Chris, very much for reaching out to Kadir and organising this catch up with him, because yeah, without you, we wouldn't be having this chat today. And I'm very glad that we did, because there's a lot of lessons too that I think we've learned here today about, I guess, working out the right method to collect community contributions, and also how MDN has evolved over the years as well, and how things have changed. So,
and I guess I would just possibly take some words out of Kadir's mouth, but like it always sounds, whenever you hear of a kind of community project you can get involved with, finding the time is hard. But if you like the sound of the MDN project, then typically at Write the Docs events on the code day, the writing day, there's an MDN group. There was in Prague. I'm sure there will be in Portland in May. So
yes,
if you want to get involved,
exactly.
You've got less than 6 months. No, 6 months. You can do some work if you find it hard to find the time in the meantime.
And if for whatever reason you can't get to one of those events, how do people get on board if they're fired up by this and they really want to contribute? How do they get on to be a contributor at MDN? What's the process?
I'm really glad you asked. So there are so many different ways to contributing to MDN, and we just covered a bunch of them. So if you are interested at all, you can go on the website, and there is a menu button there about contributing that has a lot of documentation about contributing, essentially. But if you like the personal touch, we're also on IRC, also linked from that page. So you can just come and talk to us about whatever you want to contribute to. You don't have to ask us. You can just go out on a page and look at what strikes your fancy and start editing a page. We will definitely tell you afterwards about what we think about that. You can add compat data. So if you would rather use the pull request model, you can go on our GitHub page and look at compatibility data that's currently missing from MDN. And of course, because browsers are changing all the time, there's a lot of that going on. So you can start by just adding that little bit of information and then maybe graduate to write an article on MDN. There are really lots of different ways of contributing depending on the time that you have, that you want to invest, and maybe the level that you are at the moment. But I think MDN is really one of the most open communities out there, and one with which you can have the biggest impact to whatever you write about. We have 7 million web developers coming to MDN per month. I think that's about like half of all web developers out there or something like that. So
Wow.
there's a good chance you're going to make an impact with your contribution too.
That's terrific. Thank you so much for letting us know how to do that, Kadir. And I'm sure that if folks are interested, they'll definitely take you up on that offer. So that does bring us to the end of the show, folks. Thank you very much for joining us today. Check out the show notes for different ways of contacting us. We have the Write the Docs Slack channel where you can ask real-time questions. We've also got contact information for our email addresses, and we've got the website podcast@writethedocs.org, where you can see summaries of the shows and links to information that we've been talking about, including articles like the one we were quoting today, so you can take a look and form your own opinion. So check out the website and get talking to us if you enjoyed the episode. We'd love to hear your feedback. So yeah, get in touch, and thank you again for listening. So thank you again, Kadir, for joining. Thank you, Tom and Chris. And remember, docs, or it didn't happen.